So if you look up the 7 sharp 9 chord in most of the books, they'll tell you that the 7 sharp 9 chord is parented by the altered scale. And this is true in that all of these notes, this is a D7 sharp 9 for instance, can be found in the D altered scale. They're all there, okay? But I think by having to insist that the chord and the scale relate so tightly, we miss the obvious option. Which, of course, as any rock or blues player would tell you, is simply to play the pentatonic over the top. I'm playing in a slightly jazzy way there, but there you go. So I think this is the more natural sound of the D7 sharp 9. In a sense, basically what it is what happens when you put a minor third on a D dominant chord, which is, of course, it's the blinking blues. So in terms of what's going on in the harmony there, it's really, we can think of it almost as being a seventh with an added flat third. The fact that we think of it as sharp 9 kind of makes it a bit it's exotic, but actually it's pretty essential to American music. You often hear singers singing flat thirds over dominant chords in jazz, blues, country, you name it. So because of that, I think it's actually the most vanilla or basic 7 sharp 9 sound. And I want to demonstrate that now on all blues. So the first example is pretty cool. This is using the altered scale, so it kind of sounds a bit out. It kind of sounds like, whoa, there's some jazz happening here. But the second one is, to me, much more inside and much more if you want, the default sound of the song. So if you wanted to create waves, you could use the first example, the altered scale, which is actually the textbook idea that people normally give you. Or if you wanted a kind of more sort of relaxed inside sound, then the second one seems better. And that's what I would call the default 7 sharp 9 sound. In the same way that, if you're playing major over a major chord, you've got an option to play straight major. But if you want to make it a little bit more kind of exotic, you can use the Lydian, that kind of stuff, right? Same with dominant chords. I'm going to sort of point out, I think, that a lot of the time these 7 sharp 9 chords that you see in charts are actually kind of emergent from just having simple diatonic melodies over a dominant chord. And the sort of most obvious example I can think of, which is sort of part of the basic jazz workshop sort of repertoire, is blue bossa. So we have this basic diatonic melody. It all belongs to C natural minor, which is doing this. Then we come to the G7 chord and have a B flat. So when you write down a B flat on top of the G7 chord, if you're a good jazz student, you'll respell that as being an A sharp, and then it becomes a G7 sharp 9 chord. But, in fact, actually, the note is just coming from a C minor phrase. And this is where jazz harmony is a bit different from classical harmony. In classical harmony, you would want to use... You come down the melodic minor, maybe, if you were Bach or somebody, just to kind of make sure that you don't clash with the G7 chord, but you have a nice melody at the same time. Of course, this is not what Kenny Dorham played. And I find that, is a very jazz thing. It's kind of like we're putting a blue note on top of the dominant chord, right? But of course, as soon as you write down a G7 sharp 9, you go to the textbooks and you're thinking well, I've got to play an altered scale there. Oh, it's G7 sharp 9. And then, back to C minor. I mean, that sounds great. It's not something that actually comes from the song. So the basic sort of sound of it is really just here I am playing D minor 7 flat 5, okay, fine. G7 sharp 9, well, that could just be C minor or G minor. I'm just using the pentatonics here. I think in this case, the C minor sounds more natural. It's kind of bluesy anyway, blue bossa and all of that. So you can use a C minor pentatonic there, or even a C minor blues scale. just do what a rock player would. In this case, it's slightly different from our Hendrix sort of vibe, our earlier example, where we play just the minor pentatonic over the 7 sharp 9, because in this case I'm actually playing C minor over the G7, but the effect is much the same. We get these. We also get a sharp 5 into the deal. So the way to play the dominant here, the 7 sharp 9, is just simply basically to ignore it and carry on playing in the basic minor key. And in fact, you can always do this, and this kind of means that really, as long as you're soloing on a minor melody, it all works over a minor 7 flat 5. It's a strong melody. And then if you want to put in the major third, which in the case of C minor would be a B, so the major 7th, but from the point of view of G7, that's the third. If you want to put that note in, you can. And that means you can just mix it up between the natural minor, harmonic minor, Dorian, melodic minor, whatever you fancy. As long as it's strong, it will sound good. And you don't really have to worry about, always playing exactly over the chords, because the blues gives you the capacity to if you want, you can just play C minor pentatonic over everything, and it sounds great. And often you'll hear sort of jazz improvisers, especially from the 1960s, actually doing that, and it sounds terrific. That's something which I think we know as blues and rock players, but we kind of forget with jazz, because jazz apparently always has to be so flipping complicated. There's other directions we can go in. For instance, like there's the interleaved triads thing, which is really nice. For instance, if I take this D7 sharp 9 chord, I can break it down as a D7 arpeggio, and then superimpose the D minor one on top. So, and then you can sort of mix it up. Which is a really nice bluesy sound. So if you do that on all blues, it makes an interesting sound. So if you want, you can put the relative major of the D minor over top of D major. So in this case, it would be F major. And this F major chord also has the flat 9, the sharp 9, but also the 7th as well. So it's a particularly apt choice, I think. Do the same thing up half step. Again, it's a slightly more exotic sound. These two sounds can be thought of as coming from the half-hold scale, which is certainly an option. If I remember correctly, John Coltrane uses those scales there. I mean, he liked the half-hold scale a lot. And then there's E, so we can use B flat, in fact, on D major as well. But for me, in the case of all blues, this sounds a little bit crazy. But yeah, definitely more outside. So again, it's being sensitive to the context of the song. I think if you're using a B flat triad on a D7, you're really treating it then as more of an altered dominant. And actually, as I say, I don't think that's what the D7 sharp 9 is. Lastly, one of my favourite sounds on this kind of chord is the Warne Marsh dominant 2. And that's much less known than the other scales I mentioned here, so I'll just explain it a little bit. I did do a video on it, which I'll try and remember to put a card up for. So this is where we basically thread a G7, Mixolydian or dominant scale, seamlessly into an F melodic minor. So if I'm generalising that, that's like we put the dominant scale into the melodic minor scale a whole step down, like on the flat 7th. So for instance, on the D7, we go D7, and then into C melodic minor. It's interesting, isn't it? And I find, like, particularly running it ascending, it works great over like 2-5-1s and things like that. So we can do this on all blues. I'm just using D7 going into C melodic minor there, and it sounds great actually for all blues. So that's a really nice option as well. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the voice leading of the sharp 9. This is, I think, its power. So if we use as our one chord a C major 7th, in, for instance, a 2-5-1, that's a bit weak actually, because we get the G7 and then we go to the C major 7th and we just get this common tone. I kind of hate that sound. Yeah, I mean, it has its place, right? You know, it's all right for a bossa vamp or something. But I think like that, well, one of the things about the traditional 5-1 cadence is you have contrary motion between like the F and the E, the 4 and the 3rd, and the 7 and the 1, or if you're looking at G7, the 3rd resolving up to the root of the next chord, and the 7th descends to the 3rd. That's very satisfying. So if we use a 7 sharp 9 chord, we can actually get some of that with major 7th, can you see? So we're just now moving B flat up to B. So effectively I'm actually playing a G minor 7 there, going to a C major 7, or half diminished. Like this might work beautifully, for instance, G half diminished going to C major 9th, for instance. Right? We have a really nice sort of coherent voice movement there. And, you know, you can think of things like, for instance, so there I'm using, depending how you look at it, a D flat 13 or a G7 sharp 5 sharp 9 chord going up to C major 7th. Yeah? Or you could use some kind of triad, like, I don't know, an E flat major triad. I'm going to use a spread voiced one here. Yeah? A C flat major on top of G bass note. Moving to that nice open major 7th voicing there. I find those things a lot more satisfying, and it raises the possibility of using things like, and actually this is mentioned in things like the Mark Levine Jazz Theory book, you know, using for instance like the Locrian mode to resolve to major 7th, so like this is using G Locrian, for instance, on the G7 altered. I think that sounds great, you know. So I think like thinking about, really what I'm thinking about is just like not worrying about the 3rd of the dominant chord and just thinking about the minor on top of the dominant. And then that opens up the possibility so you can use this, for instance, that F melodic minor sound on the G7, you know, you often hear that in Charlie Christian. So he's playing like E flat 7 on Rose Room going to E flat, and he plays that. Just kind of like an E flat minor 7, sorry, E flat minor major 7th, sort of arpeggio with a 6th in the middle, but obviously it kind of relates to that you know, that D flat melodic minor. So he's playing like D flat minor major 7th, D flat melodic minor over E7. And of course, like your chord scale books won't say use that because it doesn't have the 3rd. But if you think about it as being a sharp 9 and then ignoring that lower 3rd, then it makes sense. In chord scale terms, I suppose they'd call that like a Dorian flat 2, and same thing playing over the E flat 7 sus flat 9 chord. I mean, whatever incantations you have to say to make that okay for you. I prefer to think of that as just being the bluesy way that dominant chords are treated in jazz. And the more you look out for this stuff, the more you're going to see it.